Good evening, compositing and special effects students. This is Emily speaking, and I wanted to talk about tracking today, whether you're trying to add something like this lovely and sophisticated battle damage, or you want to stabilize footage that's handheld, like this car footage here. We also have a skyline that we could stabilize. And just because I don't have enough spaceship footage, here is a UFO from 20 Million Miles to Earth by Ray Harryhausen. If you don't know who he is, holy crap, pretty much our patron saint of special effects. We'll talk more about him later, and I'll get back to this example. First, we had talked about tracking a mask in the previous class, which is how we removed all of the tripods in this footage. If I double click on one of my spaceship pieces here, we could see it in the footage mode, and we can observe those tripods that were there, the creases in the green screen, the lighting. There's quite a few things here that are problematic about this shoot, but that's actually why I like the footage, is it's very rare that you'll get something from a client that's ready to go. If you were going to animate something like this particular case, you'd be better off animating a still graphic like this UFO, only because the movement of this, to use a technical term, is pretty herky-jerky. So if I go to the ship that doesn't have the battle damage yet, remember to do that track mask command. We just drew a mask, right-clicked, and then chose to track that mask. So if I draw a little mask here, which I can do with my pen tool. I'm actually going to delete that one. And let's say we want to remove the little fin on the top of our ship here. I would go to my footage. Now with this footage, I actually have it doubled. This top footage is at a different blending mode and a lowered opacity. It just gives it a little bit more depth. If I want to affect both of these ships, I could pre-compose them by selecting them both and choosing pre-compose. Let's call this complete ship. And then we can move those attributes into it or choose to leave them. I'm going to click OK. You can see it has the composition icon next to it now. And we're not going to see those other masks as they're within this composition. So if we double click on here, we can still see all of our original footage, and anything we change here will update in the new composition. So there's no grouping in After Effects. You can either pre-compose to kind of combine things, or you can parent, which I'm going to show you right now. So we need to track this ship in order to attach data to it. We can do special effects, we could do text, we could add lighting. We just need to get that data. And like I mentioned in the previous class, now that these are combined, I can mask my object. I'm definitely going to want to click M and switch that to subtract instead of add. And remember, if you're just trying to see what it looks like in the meantime, you could always switch it to none. All this is non-destructive. And if I right click on that mask, I could choose track mask, which brings up my tracker panel. We don't have too many options here other than forward or back with analyzing. Because it's slower footage, I'm just going to click track backwards, though sometimes you might want to do it frame by frame. And basically it's just going to look at what pixels are within this shape and do its best to follow it. So it's doing frame by frame animation here. You always want to watch this, even though it's not that exciting, because then if it goes astray, you can stop, adjust it, and then continue tracking it. But essentially we could use this kind of thing to remove something that we no longer want. So we gave the ship a nose job, and then it slowly pops into existence as we no longer animate that mask. That must be a necessary special effect somewhere. I'm going to delete this mask entirely. And tracking part of a piece of footage is very similar, though rather than drawing the search area with our pen tool, we're going to use a tracker. I have my footage selected, and if I go to that tracker panel, if it's not up, we can always go up to Window, Tracker. This was up because I had right-clicked to track a mask, but you could bring it up just within this little group regardless. And you could choose Track Camera, Track Motion, Warp Stabilizer, or Stabilize Motion. I'm just going to talk about these bottom two today. And essentially, when you click Track Motion, it's going to open up your footage in the layer mode, and it gives you this track point. This track point is a lot like drawing a mask, except for that we have 3 different parts. If I make these a little bit larger, think of these as a target, like if you were playing darts or shooting an arrow. You've got your very middle thing here, which is your attach point. This is basically like your anchor point of the object. Then you have your feature region. This is where your main object's going to be. And then you have your search region. And anywhere that the movement of that feature object's going to go, you want it to be within this search region. So there's not really a right or wrong for how big the tracker is. It really just depends on what you're tracking. Today we're going to track this corner right here. It's really important whenever you're tracking that you have a high contrast object. So there's a couple of points on this ship that would be good for it. I'm going to track this corner. And before we analyze, maybe the most important thing here is choosing what our target is. When we're stabilizing footage, we're actually going to target the footage we're tracking, but here we want to apply this data to something. And I could go back into the footage itself, and I could add that little damage ping. That looks basically like a bullet hole. Clearly we have to scale that down. I could apply the data to this, but like I showed you in the example, we also have the smoke elements and the fire elements, which are actually just some effects. So what I like to do is, rather than attaching the data to one particular asset, I like creating a null object. To add a null object, it's just a layer type. So I'm just going to go Layer, New, Null Object. And this is basically a square with an anchor point. It doesn't render, it doesn't do anything aside from control other layers that are attached to it. So whether you're looking at toggle switches or modes, you always have this parent and link drop down. And this is where you would choose the null as your parent. Now, I've already used a few nulls in this previously. So I'm just going to call this master null. Doesn't matter what you call it. I called it master nuck because my spelling is amazing. And I'm going to position this just at the front of the ship. It doesn't have to be over the exact place. In fact, nulls are awesome because they allow you to move things afterwards, even when they're animated. And it's one of the only ways to quote-unquote group. You can pre-compose like we did for the ships, or you can attach multiple things to a null. You could have one parent and multiple children, so to speak. So I'm going to track this high contrast little corner here. And I'm going to click on my footage, and when you click Track Motion, it just opens it up into the layer mode. So I'm going to adjust this point, and I've got my search region, my feature region, and then what it's attaching to. And I'm just going to move this to this high contrast point right here. We want it to be as contrasty, if that's a word, as possible. That's going to make it easier to track. And then we're going to make our target that null. So I'm just going to click Edit Target and make sure that's the thing applied. So we can really apply this data to anything, but I highly recommend a null, which we can parent to other objects later. So just like with the track mask, I'm going to analyze forward or backward. Doesn't really matter where. I'm just going to start in the middle here. And you definitely want to watch to make sure that it's following that attach point. It can slip if there was like a shadow that crossed in part of it, or the contrast wasn't as high. And you can see it placed a whole bunch of keyframes there. If we click U to show keyframes, you could see that all 3 of those factors, the feature center, the confidence, and the attach point, all have their own keyframes. And I would just jump to where I started and continue moving forward. And if there was an issue, you could just pause, adjust the point, and then continue tracking. If you have something really fast moving, you might want to track frame by frame, which isn't terribly exciting, but will give you much better results in the end. And so I'm going to finish tracking that. If I scrub through, it seems like it's pretty well aligned. Let's zoom in just a little bit. But I think that looks good. So I want to make sure that my target is correct, and I'm going to click apply. And it'll ask if I want to apply it around the X, Y, or either one. I'm going to do both. And now when we go back into our main footage, we can see that this null, let me highlight it so you can see it, this null is attached to that point. So remember, the null doesn't render, it just provides us with something to control other layers. Like, for instance, this ping of the damage. So I'm going to bring that in and obviously scale it down. I'm going to scale it to about where it works on the ship. And without doing anything, it's just going to line up for that one moment. So I'm going to position this where I want it. And then I'm going to parent this ping to the null. So in the parent dropdown, I can choose master null, or you've got this little pick whip thing, and I could pick whip the master null from there. But we want this child element to say master null or null1, null2, whatever it's named, in the parent and link column. And now you can see that that will move with that null's information. And it doesn't matter if we change the scale or coloring. If I applied the tracking data to this damage here and then tried moving it, it would disrupt all of the keyframes. So I really like having this null, because now when we add other things like our smoke element, which we also need to scale down quite a bit, and obviously I'm going to adjust this, but just as an example, if I scale this down to just kind of move it to the side, it doesn't matter where it is on the screen. If it's parented to the null object, the layer order doesn't matter with nulls, you can see that that's going to move with it too. So that null object becomes the master object for everything else. I'm going to unparent that for a moment. That doesn't sound awkward. And in the previous class, I talked about using blending modes. In fact, if we go into the ship composition, this top ship, like I said, is actually set to soft light. It's just giving us a little bit more definition overall. In this composition, oh, that's the finished one, I've actually added quite a few blending modes here. You can see there's luminosity, linear dodge, screen twice. So in this one we're working on, I want to remove the black from this smoke. Now we already know about keying, but we really don't want to key black. I could go to Effect, Keying, and Extract. So if I add Extract to this footage here and try to adjust the black or white point, I can remove it, but you can see it gives it a pretty rough edge. So instead of using something like Extract or Keying, I'm actually just going to try a different blending mode. If you don't see these, you just want to click where it says Toggle Switches Modes, and that will jump back and forth. The parenting column is always there. So I want to see my modes, and I can click and go through these individually, but one of my favorite shortcuts in any Adobe program is Shift plus or minus to cycle through your different blending modes. And we can send through these. Let me zoom out a little. If we want black smoke, Subtract looks cool. Exclusion gives us kind of a gray smoke. Classic Difference looks really cool. Maybe in space that's what it looks like. We don't know. Smoke I don't think would be flowing like this anyways, but that's okay. It's science fiction. Emphasis on the fiction part. So I'm just going to go through here. We could see Linear Dodge is a nice bright smoke. Classic Color Dodge. And I like Screen because it just knocks all the black out of the background. So I think that works pretty well. However, because this was a big rectangular asset, the anchor point's right in the middle. So one of the things you want to make sure of, especially when tracking, is where the anchor point is. I'm going to click on my Pan Behind tool, and I'm just going to move that down to this kind of edge to the smoke. Also, this is flowing a way I don't want it to. I could rotate it and just kind of spin it around, but I want to actually transform it. I'm going to right click on this and I'm going to flip it horizontally so it's going the other way. I'm going to switch back to my move tool and I'm just going to position that so it's roughly coming out of the battle damage there. Let's scale that up a little bit. It's going to scale funny. I'm going to go up in the negative number just because it's flipped. And if I play it back, it looks good except for it is not attached yet. So again, I am just going to parent this to the master null just to make things more clear. I'm going to put the null on top, though that does not affect the rendering at all. And now we can see we have this smoke footage that moves along with it. Now, two things I want to do with this smoke footage. Let's just let this RAM preview first. One is the original footage has this kind of hole coming out of it. And two, this smoke is moving pretty fast. For a big ship like this in outer space where smoke probably won't show up at all, we want this to be a little bit slower. So I'm going to take care of both those things. I'm going to reposition this a little bit, and I'm going to use my pen tool with the smoke selected, and I'm just going to cut out this little bottom part here. The default for this mask is add, so I'm just going to change this to subtract, and so it punches that shape out of the smoke, but obviously we want to feather that edge. So I'm going to twirl down my mask options and really increase that feather and maybe just move these points around a little bit. And now if I scrub through, I just get rid of that initial hole I want to get rid of. And now I also want to slow the footage down. So when I right click on this MP4, I can go to time, and time remapping is something we'll do in an upcoming class. You can kind of simulate bullet time or things like that with it by speeding up and slowing down things. I like time stretch for this because it's just going to make it slower overall. So I'm going to go to time stretch. Right now it's at 100%. Let's see what it looks like at 200%. It's going to tell you what the new duration is. And now if I play that back, it's probably hard to see because it hasn't been RAM previewed yet. If we bring in our work area, we could sample just a little bit here and see that that smoke is a little bit more lumbering than before, which is what we want with our time stretch. And so I think this is looking pretty good. We might want to add some more adjustments to things, like that damage doesn't quite match the ship. We can actually play with the blending modes for that too. If we Command Shift minus through it, I think luminosity actually looks pretty cool versus normal. It has that kind of brown appearance to it. We can also, of course, go in and affect our color correction. So if I go to my levels or curves or tritone, which we'll use in just a moment, I can adjust this to better match the ship or look however I want it to. So I'm just going to undo that. Now I want to add a fire effect here, and of course I could import a fire asset, but I want to show you and just encourage you to play within After Effects. There's so many things that this program can do. There's really endless outcomes and ways of doing things. And to create this little fire effect, I actually just used a preset background. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a solid, which is basically our sacrificial lamb in After Effects. Let's call this fire. Very creative, I know. I'm going to put it at, I'm actually just going to solo it for now. If I click in this column with the little white dot, it will only show us this layer. I'm going to go to my effects menu where there's so many options. There is a search bar. You can also go to these from animation, browse presets, which is going to launch Bridge. It is nice because it shows you a preview, but I know specifically that I want to go to my presets and my backgrounds. I'm going to choose the one called Cinders. So I'm just going to drag this one onto the solid. And what I like about the presets is it gives you a bunch of effects that you might not combine otherwise. So this is just a solid that has glow, tritone, and fractal noise applied twice. If I deselect, I could show you what each one does. The glow is most obvious. It's just adding that lovely outer glow there. And of course, any one of these things we can modify. The tritone is what's actually applying the color. Fractal noise, which is used in a lot of effects, is just black and white otherwise. So if we want to adjust this, we can, which is not going to make a huge difference, but maybe we don't want the shadows to be quite that black, or maybe we do. Let's make them a little bit brighter. And then the fractal noise itself is what's adding this interesting pattern. And so it's just doubled up to give it more of that. But with fractal noise, you have all these different things like the evolution that you can change, the complexity. I'm just going to undo that. It's already keyed for animation because it's a preset. And so if we scrub through, we get this nice little fiery effect. I am going to unsolo this. And I'm going to use my pen tool, and I just want to draw a little zigzaggy kind of shape on this solid. So we're going to mask it down. All right, and we're done. Well, maybe not, but let's scale this down a little bit. And it's scaling from the anchor point, so we actually might want to move that to the center of our little burn here. And if I twirl down my options, I can go to my masks and also feather that edge a little bit. I also can change the expansion depending on how large or small I want this shape to be. And then don't worry about the color as much because that's going to change along the way here. So I'm going to position this where I want it. I'm going to scale it down a little bit. And I want it to be on top of the damage ping but below the smoke. So I'm just going to scale this down a little bit more. And then if we RAM preview that part, once we do the final most important ingredient, which is parenting. So I'm going to go to my fire layer here. I'm going to parent that to the null. So now we have the damage, the fire, and the smoke attached to that one null object. And now that will move with it. So hopefully you get the idea of how to use these different effects in tandem with each other and grouped with this null object or pre-composing to move to a more terrestrial and therefore probably boring example. So I've got this handheld car footage here, and if we want to do something similar like we did to the ship, maybe not add battle damage, that seems rude, but if we want to add some text here, we can use a really similar technique. So with this footage selected, I'm just going to go to my tracker panel, which if it's buried, remember you can just go Window, Tracker. And again, I'm going to click Track Motion, which is going to open it up in the layer mode. I have my tracker here. I'm going to expand my search and feature area a little bit. And I'm just going to attach it to this nice little corner right there. I think that stays really visible the whole time. And actually, let me scrub to the end here. You don't need to track from the beginning. It really just depends on what works best for you. It's going to add the same amount of keyframes either way. And so I also need my target, but this is something we can add at any time. I'm going to come back to that, even though best practices wise, I usually have that already. I'm going to track backwards and watch it to make sure it's tracking correctly. And I don't know if we need to do this entire clip, so I'll track it to like the 20-second mark here. Alright, that seems to look good. Let's change our work area to just that setting. And if we scrub through, it seems like it follows it pretty well. We really don't know until we attach it. So right now we're in the layer mode. I'm going to go back into just the composition. And I could add a null, but just for comparison's sake, I'm going to add some text here that just very creatively says road trip. And wow, that is not a font I would normally use. I don't know what that is from, but let's go with something safer and more boring. I'm going to sample that red from his rear view there. And let's just position this wherever we want it to be. How about there? And now we're going to make this our target. So if I go back into my layer mode here and go to my tracker, I'm going to click on this footage just to make sure it's highlighted and it gives me that data that's already there. I'm going to click Edit Target and choose that text. And I'm going to click Apply. I want it to be along the X and Y. And now I have this text that moves along. Now you could see, even though I wanted it down here, it placed it up where that other object is, because that essentially becomes its anchor point. I'm going to undo that. Now if we want that text to stay down here, we're just going to move its anchor point to be roughly where that attach point is. So it's not going to relocate this text. This is another reason I like using a null object, especially because if we try moving this afterwards, all those keyframes are applied to this text. Now that I've adjusted the anchor point of that object, I'm going to apply. And now you can see it stays where we wanted it originally. We might want to track more than one thing, like scale or rotation, which we'll do in the next class. I'm just going to hide this text for now. The other thing I wanted to show today is just stabilizing footage. And it's done the exact same way as far as tracking goes, but then instead of applying it to a target, you apply it to itself. So you could reset the footage or delete the keyframes, and I'm going to choose Stabilize Motion. And it looks exactly like track motion does, except for it automatically assumes that the target is the footage itself. I could use that same point, but just to do, let's actually use that for now. In the next class, I'm going to track this, but at an angle. And let's track this forward. And track it back. Rather than jumping to the beginning, I'm just going to go where I left off. If you want to see the actual keyframes, you can zoom in a little bit here. And we're actually just seeing the preview. If you click U, you'll see all those keyframes there. Not that we need to see them, but just FYI. So I'm just going to continue tracking here, making sure that my attach point stays on target. All right. And if we're just going to this part here, I think that looks good. So we'll apply it. It's applying to itself. And now when we watch it, it's a little weird because it's going to seem like it moves less, but you can see that it's actually shifting around. It animates the anchor point of the object. If we scale this up, we can hide those changes, and it looks a little bit better than before, but you can tell that we are using this area as the attach point. One thing I wanted to point out before we changed anything was a way that you can tell if footage is shaky, though it's pretty obvious with this footage, is to use a guide. If we know that the horizon line doesn't change at all, and actually let's just use that point as an example. Technically that should stay pretty level, but as we scrub through, you can see it jumps up and down quite a bit. If we go to the one that we just changed, and go Command R to bring up our rulers, and drag a guide down, you could see the one that's been tracked is nice and even there. But that's also because that was our attach point. So really just depends on what kind of footage you're looking for. In the next class, we're going to talk about working with more than one track point. So using a similar technique, we can track motion or stabilize motion. And just as one last example, I've got my skyline here. And if I hide my UFO for now and drag down my guide here for my horizon line, you can see it shifts around a little bit. There's not anything really high contrast here, which is a problem, but I'm going to click Stabilize Motion, and it's going to give me my tracking data. And I'm going to track one of these buildings up here. So I'm going to give myself a pretty large search area, and I feel like This corner's probably the most distinct one. And I'm at the beginning of the footage, so the target is the footage itself. I'm going to analyze forward. And the only problem with this footage is that this part moves off of the screen at some point. So it's going to be harder to track that because this reference point isn't going to be there. So I'm just tracking a little bit here. You can see it's slow going. So obviously if you had a really long clip, you'd want to set some time aside for this. And this footage doesn't even shake all that much, but this is why it's always good to plan ahead and use a tripod. But most of the time we have our phones these days, and we can clean it up a little here. Now I can see that this point is shifting a little bit. I'm just going to leave it to here, and I'm going to apply this. So now you can see as we scrub through, it's really minor, but you can see that it doesn't really stray from... Now we do have the original footage underneath it, so let me just hide that quick. You can see, like with the car footage, that it shifted it around, but it always stays in the right spot. So just like with the other thing, we'd have to click S for a scale and scale up, drag this down a little bit, and we could see that this shot seems pretty level, whereas the original one kind of shakes up and down quite a bit. So stabilizing motion is something you can do to help fix a document that wasn't shot with a tripod or Steadicam, but we can also use this technique to follow an object and add things to it, though I definitely recommend using a null for that parenting. So we'll talk about corner pinning and 3D camera tracking in the next class, which gives you a lot more data, but also takes that much longer to do. So I hope you enjoyed this lesson. Please practice tracking, and we'll talk more in the next class.